Split screen multiplayer is a fun thing to have in games sometimes. What better way to lose your friends is there than to play Mario Kart with them in the same room on the same screen and see them deliberately targeting you with green shells despite the fact that you're in last place? Let's talk about how to do that in GameMaker. So this is a 3D project. This is a basic 3D project. It's the same one I've been using in my videos for the last 29-ish episodes. You can see there's a couple objects in 3D space. They do some things. There are some lights. There's some fake shadows underneath them. There's only one screen though. There's only one camera rendering at a time. Let's talk about how to increase that number. First, we're going to talk about views. Views are something I've more or less ignored for most of the series. You probably are aware in GameMaker that you can have a bunch of views in a room, and you can use those views to show different parts of the room. You can follow different characters around, that sort of thing. And in 3D, it more or less works the same way, except we have to do a little bit of extra work. So in GameMaker Studio 2, the view system has kind of been divided into two different parts compared to what it was in GameMaker Studio 1. Instead of just having a list of viewport variables in the room editor down here, it has been separated into a camera section and a viewport section. The camera section is what you would ordinarily use in a 2D game to follow an object around. You have your X position, your Y position, your width, and your height. If you've ever worked with orthographic cameras, those values probably sound suspiciously familiar. We will be ignoring those for the time being. And then below that, there are the viewport properties, which is the actual part of the game window which is dedicated to each view. So things like the left half of the screen versus the right half of the screen versus whatever you want. So far in the series, I haven't really messed with viewports. You can, if you want to, you can say enable viewports and then set the default viewport visible to true. The way GameMaker works with viewports is if viewports are enabled, it will render each of the enabled viewports in sequence. It will render each of the cameras through a specific part of the game window in sequence. 0 through 7, you can have up to 8 viewports active at once. And if you don't have viewports enabled, instead the draw event will just use the default camera. It will render to the entire game window, and it won't really give you any options for viewport settings or anything like that, except for what you define through the default camera. I chose to use camera get active when it comes to getting the currently active camera in the draw event. You can also use camera get default to get the default camera, or you can get camera get, I believe it's view get camera, and you can pass this function in a view index, and it will get the camera that is tied to that view. I'll get to that later. There we go. So if I run the game now with viewports enabled and viewport 0 turned to visible, I don't remember if I did this already, like 2 minutes ago, you'll see that nothing has changed. This is what the game looked like before. If you mess with the camera properties, nothing is going to happen. We are essentially overriding the camera properties in the code over here in this section where we set the camera's view and projection matrix. Even when you're doing things in 2D, cameras still have a view and projection matrix. It's just, in that case, the game will handle it for you using things like the camera properties. This can be both a blessing and a curse. I happen to like the changes to the camera that GameMaker Studio 2 made, but I've also seen a number of people get confused by them. I like it because it gives you somewhat more control over the camera than the old D3D projection functions did in GameMaker Studio 1 and older. But at the same time, I think it's the camera system is one of the more consistent sources of confusion for people just getting started, and perhaps Yo-Yo Games could have done a little bit more to make them more user-friendly. Regardless, the viewport properties are what I'm interested in. So we're going to, instead of saying viewport properties X position 0, Y position 0, width 1024, height 768, we're going to cut the width in half as some of the first steps towards making the camera only take up one side of the screen. You can see that it has also cut the game window in half. The size of the game window itself is a bit of a funny thing in GameMaker. It's tied to the dimensions of all the active viewports. You can set the size of the viewport manually through code if you wanted to, using the window set, size? Using the window set size function, and if you were to do things like implement multiple resolutions in the game, that's often what you would do. But unless you do that, the size of the game window is determined by the total dimensions of all the viewports that are currently active. And if you don't have any views currently active, it's just the sides of the room. Let's move on. So I don't really care about the dimensions of the game window itself. I'm just going to go with 1024 by 768 because that was the default size of the game window in this project, the default room size in this project. You can go with whatever you want. You can go with 1280 by 720 or 1920 by 1080 for all I care. If you've got a 4K monitor, you can go with that. It doesn't matter. What is going to matter is going to be the dimensions of the stuff inside the window relative to the window. I'm going to be going with a side-by-side split screen right now. There's going to be a camera rendering on the left and a camera rendering on the right. And if you were to do a little bit of geometry to get the size of those viewports, the dimensions, you would find that my camera view on the left is going to be 512 pixels wide because my total window is 1024, and the height is going to be 768 because the height of my window is 768, but I'm not cutting it in half. And its X and Y position are going to be 0, 0. Because 0, 0 is the upper left corner of the screen, and that's where we are now. If you've decided that you want your game window to be some other size, you will have to adjust the values, the height and width values accordingly.
Hey.
Next, I'm going to also enable viewport number 1, so the second one, because these are indexed from 0, like many things in computers, and the X and Y position are going to be 512 and 0, because 512 is the middle of the screen, horizontally. And we want our second viewport to start at the middle top of the screen, so that will be 512 and 0. And the same as the width and height of the viewport on the left, the viewport on the right, which is what we're looking at now, is going to be 512 by 768. So let me run the game now, and it's going to look it's going to look like something. It's not going to be a black screen. You can see there are two cameras side by side. They look a little bit squished. This kind of reminds me of how something like a VR headset would look, with two cameras slightly offset from each other for the left and the right eye. These are not actually slightly offset from each other. These cameras are in the exact same position, but that's what it reminds me of. You can see that they're a little bit squished. So the aspect ratio for these things is the same as it was before, but they now only take up half the window, so they've been squished horizontally. That is not really what we want. We prefer things like the circles to look a little bit more circular and less elliptical. So let's look at the code that defines the aspect ratio in our camera code. I realized that I probably didn't name the camera object very well because the camera object is named camera, but the system of cameras in GameMaker is a separate thing. This is where calling it something like OBJ camera or O camera or something like that would have probably been a little bit more advantageous than the Pascal case that I ended up using, because you can't really pronounce Pascal case. You can't pronounce capital letters differently from lowercase letters.
Hey.
So the aspect ratio of the camera is part of its projection matrix. Over here in line 28, projection matrix equals matrix build projection perspective field of view. That's a mouthful. It's the second argument in that function. Currently that is set to negative window get width over window get height. Yes, the aspect ratio is negative. 3D graphics are weird. GameMaker makes them weirder. And instead of being the width and the height of the window, which is why they are why the aspect ratio is the same as before, just compressed horizontally, we would like to change that to view get Wport, view get Wport, something over view get Hport, something. So these functions relating to views take a view index, and that is not, in fact, a camera. I don't actually know what would happen if you pass a camera to these functions. I'm guessing nothing good, unless the indices of the camera happen to coincidentally match up with the indices that I'm looking for, and it looks like it does. Anyway, that's not how these functions work. These functions don't take a camera. Instead, they take an index of the view, which would be something like 0 for viewport 0, 1 for viewport 1, and so on and so forth. And there is a built-in constant in GameMaker which holds the, well, it's not a constant, but there is a built-in read-only variable in GameMaker which holds the value of the view that is currently active, that is currently being rendered through, and that is view current. So view current will have a value of 0 if you're currently rendering through view number 0. It will have a value of 1 if you're currently rendering through view number 1, and so on and so forth. And if we run the game using that, that will provide the correct aspect ratio. Okay. We are no longer compressed horizontally. The sphere in the middle of the room is now more or less a sphere. The sort of spherical planetoid Saturn thing that is our player is now more or less a roughly sort of spherical planetoid thing, or whatever I just called it. And we are in business. So generally, unless you're doing something aforementioned like virtual reality, if you have multiple views going at once, you don't want both of them to contain the exact same picture. You probably want one to be following around one player, another to be following around another player or something like that. I do not currently have a system for more than one player in this game, and I don't want to turn this into a tutorial for doing that. So instead, I will, let's see. So I'll have one view follow around the player and another view just sit in the corner of the room, sort of like a surveillance camera, I think is what I'm going to do. So using view current, you can use this like any other variable. Obviously, you can do things like use it in a comparison in an if statement. You can say if view current equals 0, then the x2, y2, z2, x from y from z from variables contain one thing. Otherwise, you can say, let's see, I suppose going with the surveillance camera thing, you can say x2 is going to be the room origin. Z2, 0, no assignment there. So we are going to be looking at the room origin from the opposite corner of the room from some distance in the air. And this is not going to move with the player or anything. It's just going to sit there in the second viewport. So let's run the game. And here we are. So you can see on the left part of the screen, I'm just running around as normal. Camera's following the player. And on the right side of the screen, the camera's just sitting there on the wall. Vital testing apparatus, please do not destroy. And you can see the player as the player like walks around doing things in the room, crashing into these objects with collision shapes. Okay. I'm sure you all have no shortage of ideas of what you can do with a system like that, with a surveillance thing. Maybe you can make like Five Nights at Freddy's number 6 or whatever they're up to by now. So something else you might have noticed in the, I guess something worth mentioning, there are, in addition to view get W port, view get H port, there are a few camera functions related to the width and height of the camera. Camera get width, camera get, what is it, view width. There we go. Camera get view width, and camera get view height. And these functions do indeed take a camera index, as you can see in the argument help at the bottom of the code window. Those relate to the camera properties, X position, Y position, width, and height of the camera. I'm not using those right now because, like I said, those are kind of not useful to what we're doing because we are setting the camera matrices ourselves. If you were to set the camera width to 512 and the camera height to whatever, you would be able to use these functions to get the width and height of the camera. It would produce the same value. It's just, I feel like using the viewport functions are more correct because those are the values that are actually relevant to the size of the views. Okay, this is the basis of how you would set up split screen in GameMaker. There's a lot you can do with this information, even if you're not necessarily making a game that's running in split screen. You can set the camera matrices, you can set the camera view and projection matrices, and then camera apply it. Anytime you draw anything, it doesn't even have to be in the regular draw event when you're drawing to the screen, when you're drawing to the application surface. If you were to draw to just a regular surface that you created somewhere in like the create event somewhere, you could set the camera matrices there yourself when you're drawing onto the surface, and then you could render a 3D projection onto the surface or whatever you want. You could even mess with the camera matrices in the draw GUI event, which is admittedly not something that you probably want to do most of the time, but you can do it if you want. And that allows you to do some potentially useful things, such as using a 3D projection as the texture for a surface, which is drawn somewhere else in 3D, or having a 3D object being rendered on the user interface or something like that. GameMaker has a reputation for being garbage at 3D, and it's not so much that GameMaker is garbage at 3D. It certainly could be better. It's certainly not as good as things like Unreal Engine 4 or whatever, but the tools that you would use to do interesting things in 3D are not necessarily tools that you would think about using for anything in 2D. But at the same time, understanding how they work could allow you to do some things in 2D that you might have not thought possible before. I'm gonna make an orthographic cameras video eventually, I promise. Anyway, that's it. I'm gonna stop talking now. The code for this is going to be in the video description. Let's commit tutorial contents to master. I will have this on GitHub when I post the video. I have a Patreon for these things, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, there's the link to that in all the usual places. Other than that, I try to post about 2 videos a week, 2 of these videos a week, plus a bunch of Let's Plays. In the past couple of weeks, I've been posting 3. I've been doing the tower defense thing on Wednesdays and 2 videos on Saturdays. I'm probably not going to be doing that again for a while. There is going to be a decent amount of construction in and around where I live for the next couple of weeks, probably through December-ish, is what they're saying. I'm expecting to find that I'm going to have to try and schedule recording times around when the construction is happening so that there's not a ton of, like, truck noises in the background and that sort of thing.
Hey.
They're not here right now today, so I'm hoping I can get in a couple GameMaker recordings within the span of today and build up a bit of a buffer in case things don't go very well. Anyway, that's it. I hope you found that useful, and I will see you all later. Big ol' thank you to Edward Holt, Indie Punch, and Zenith for supporting these videos. If you want your name in the credits and to have me say them out loud at the end of every video, head over to the Patreon page in the video description and join the fun.